What's up, y'all? My name is JR, and for those of you who don't already know, I'm a huge movie and TV nerd. If you're new here, I appreciate you taking the time to check out my channel. I hope you'll consider sticking around and joining the film community I'm trying to build here on YouTube. So, in today's video, I'm going to be talking about why a 45-year-old indie horror film with a $300,000 budget is still regarded as the greatest slasher film ever made. I figure anyone who has wanted to watch this movie has certainly done so by now, but just in case you haven't, this video will contain spoilers, so if you're not trying to hear about anything that happens in the movie, you might want to exit this video right now. And with that being said, no more wasting time, let's get into it. So, Halloween is an American independent slasher film that came out in 1978. The film is directed and scored by John Carpenter, co-written by the film's producer, Deborah Hill, and it stars Donald Pleasance and Jamie Lee Curtis in her film debut, with PJ Soles and Nancy Loomis in supporting roles. Set mostly in the fictional town of Haddonfield, Illinois, the plot centers on a mental patient, Michael Myers, who was committed to a sanitarium for murdering his teenage sister on Halloween night when he was a child. And then, 15 years later, having escaped that same sanitarium, he returns to his hometown where he stalks teenage babysitter Laurie Strode and her friends while being pursued by his psychiatrist, Dr. Samuel Loomis. Now, filming for this movie took place in Southern California in May of 1978, a long time ago. The film premiered in October the same year and managed to gross $70 million before becoming the most profitable independent films, one of the most profitable independent films of all time. Now, Carpenter received praise for his direction and for the score, with many critics crediting the film as the first in a long line of slasher films inspired by Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which came out in 1960, and Bob Clark's Black Christmas, which came out in 1974. And despite being made after Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which also featured a masked killer, Halloween is considered to be one of the greatest and most influential horror films ever made. In 2006, in fact, it was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. The film also spawned a film franchise comprising 13 films, which helped construct an extensive backstory for its antagonist, Michael Myers, sometimes narratively diverging entirely from previous movies, but, there's that. And additionally, a novelization, a video game, and a comic book series were created, all based on the film. So, what's the deal with this 45-year-old movie? How does a $300,000 indie have the cultural relevance and the staying power that this film has had? Well, okay, so here's what I think. First, I think Halloween had a genius-level marketing plan, whether it was done intentionally or not. Naming the film Halloween was such a good move because, unlike the handful of slasher films that came before it, it gave the film an identity that made it feel different than the other films. During Halloween, a holiday where kids dress up and wear masks, Michael Myers did the same, donning the jumpsuit of a mechanic that he killed on his way to his hometown, along with a Captain Kirk mask, minus the eyebrows. And this allowed him to blend in his small town, even though, as you rewatch the film, you realize that it was an utterly ridiculous notion that he would blend in, especially, in broad daylight. And outside of John Carpenter composing one of the most iconic horror film theme songs ever, naming the film Halloween gave the film longevity, real staying power, so much so that there was a film that came just a few years later that tried the same thing. You might know that film, it's Friday the 13th. Now, this leads me to my second point. I think Halloween was able to set the template for slasher films that would give birth to multiple horror films and franchises that were released throughout the 80s and 90s, including Sean S. Cunningham's own independent slasher film released in 1980. Friday the 13th was clearly inspired by the Halloween film, from the name of the film being synonymous with a specific day on the calendar, to Jason Voorhees wearing his dark denim overalls and eventually donning his equally iconic hockey mask. But remnants of Halloween can be seen in dozens of slasher films that came after it, from Friday the 13th all the way through the Scream films, wherein the killers also donned masks and mostly killed with large knives. Thirdly, Halloween, the movie, feels perfectly paced. I think pacing is the key to any great horror movie, and the best horror movies take their time building up to the first big scare or kill. And, in my mind, Halloween executes this trick nearly perfectly. Once Michael Myers escapes from the mental institution, there's a long build-up to his first on-screen kill. After that, every subsequent murder takes the time to create additional suspense. Now, as slashers became more popular and more of them started getting made, a lot of them would try to cram in as many kill scenes as they could, and after a while, the deaths would lose their impact because there was no time to build tension in between them. Another thing I really liked about Halloween is that it's a story about violence that, ironically, doesn't entirely depend on it. And since Halloween, a lot of slashers has used its genre and premise as an excuse to focus on excessive amounts of blood and gore. And although when Halloween was released, it faced criticisms of excessive gore by contemporary critics, the violence in Halloween is actually pretty reserved, especially by today's standards, in that a lot of it took place off-screen. So the rare cases of on-screen violence used by Carpenter in the film are much more effective. What I also think worked for this particular film was Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie Strode. In horror cinema, there's a lot of emphasis placed on the villain more so than the hero. The hero, as it is typically female and is usually just there to be terrorized by the villain. Most of the time with a rather bland characterization outside of maybe her looks or perhaps her virtue. Meanwhile, the other women in the film tend to be portrayed as promiscuous by comparison and therefore are served up to the villain to be slaughtered as recompense for their sins. And though Laurie Strode is virtuous compared to her other two friends in the film, she's also a well-rounded protagonist. She seems easy to relate to, being a regular teen who babysits kids in her neighborhood, but she also proves herself to be exceptionally capable by the end of the movie. In short, she's not the last girl simply because she's a virgin or because she abstains from using drugs or alcohol. She's the last girl because she thinks quick on her feet and seems determined to defend herself against Michael Myers. And finally, speaking of Michael Myers, I happen to think he's the undisputed GOAT of slasher villains. Most slasher villains have a gimmick or at least a discernible weakness of some kind, but Michael was just an unmitigated problem, right? I mean, he was just a deranged killer, straight no chaser, with no discernible personality, unlike a Nightmare on Elm Street's Freddy Krueger, who was as charismatic as he was terrifying. And I gotta say, he was the slasher villain I was the most afraid of as a child. I mean, if a man can get you in your dreams, I just don't know what you do about that. That's just an L waiting to happen. And in the credits, Michael Myers isn't even referred to as Michael Myers. John Carpenter called him the Shape because he was conceived to be a faceless embodiment of just evil. I mean, he never says a word, which makes him all that much more terrifying, unlike the Ghostface killers in the Scream franchise, for example. And if that weren't enough, he could run, he could drive, so that made escaping his wrath that much more unlikely. He didn't reside in a dreamscape, he didn't live in the woods. He was everywhere and nowhere all at once. But what do you guys think? Do you think John Carpenter's Halloween is the best slasher film ever made? Or do you prefer one of the films inspired by it more? Let me know in the comments. And for those of you who might be new to the channel, be sure to like and share this video. If you really like the content, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell That way you'll be notified whenever I drop a new video. Also, be sure to go check out themadScreenwriter.com for more television and film reviews and info on my upcoming film projects. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. I got screenplays to write, and I'll catch y'all in the next video.